edition of Off the Tube in AP World History Distance Learning. Uh, just to contextualize for our day today, we've been studying the modern era. And the theme of the modern era, of course, is the really tricky and difficult one of modernity. And we know that the modern era is going to be seen and was seen as a second golden age for Europe. And Europe is going to come to define what a modern society is. And those events that happen within Europe help to shed light on what it means to be modern and so hip and chic. And of course, the first definition of a modern society we saw in chapter 17 is one that applies Enlightenment values into their society and into their politics. One that tries to promote this idea that everyone should equally have a say. Excuse me, not everyone. All men. Sorry, ladies. All men should have an equal say in the way that they are governed and the way that society is organized. And so the first definition being an enlightened society. The second definition comes from another revolution that occurred in Europe, and that is the Industrial Revolution, because the second definition is a society that is fully industrialized, and that brings with it all of those characteristics of an industrially powerful society. Now, Europe, being industrialized and having the might of their industrialization, were constantly on the search for three things. They were always looking for access to cheap resources, specifically because they lost the colonies in the Americas at the beginning of this time period. They're looking for access to cheap labor. Again, they lost the Americas, and the slave trade has now been abolished. And because they are now fully industrialized, or most places in Europe are fully industrialized, they have periodic surplus of goods that they need to unload, and so they need new markets. So the search for resources, labor, and markets is going to cause Europe to knock on the doors of places outside of their own societies. And as we're looking at Europeans knocking on the doors, what we've been looking at this week is, well, what's the response? What is it, especially from those places that were formerly centralized, were formerly powerful, that actually played a large role in not only their own region, but also in some cases around Afro-Eurasia. And so the first supplemental assignment, you looked at the Ottoman Empire and China as two of the most powerful early modern empires that there were, and how by the beginning they started to fall apart. Well, today we're going to look at Japan specifically, and we're going to look at kind of how Japan is going to dramatically shift and how they are going to go through a process of modernization in order to A, help to solidify their own authority, but also B, to push back against those external threats from Europeans and Americans, from Westerners in general. But before we do that, I thought it'd be really something that's really important to think about is kind of, we're talking about these interactions between Western society and non-Western society, particularly Asian society. And as these two are interacting, you can feel the tension and the conflict between them and between how they're interacting. And especially as we've been looking at the process of modernization in China and the Ottoman Empire, you can tell that there's some difficulty in figuring out how they should be industrializing. What extent should they be borrowing from the West? What extent should they do things on their own? And this makes total sense, since these civilizations only a few hundred years earlier were way more powerful and influential than Europe. So essentially, what constitutes that change? And really, I want to look at, how do both sides view the other? Right, so we look at how do Europeans view those in Asia and those in outside the world, and then how do those Asians look at Europeans? So I want to look at the perception of others for just a bit. So I'm going to go through just a brief little mini lecture here to kind of discuss this concept. So let's start with the European perception of other. Again, this is going to be tied to the European understanding of modernity. So as we're looking at this is part of Europe kind of coming into its own and realizing the power of its industrialization. And so as we look, we see that actually throughout European history, there's always been this concept that they are different than other people. And so how did they characterize that? Well, originally, it was simply just tied to them being Christians. They realized that Christianity had its hub in Europe, and anybody who wasn't a Christian was a pagan, somebody who didn't believe in Christianity, somebody who practiced another religion. That was one way of separating and defining the other. Well, eventually, and especially as the ideas of the Enlightenment begin to occur, and we start to think about, as Europeans start to think about what man's natural state is, and what is it that connects all of humanity, and you start to see more scientific thoughts about the organization of society. Europeans were looking at groups, especially those that they had conquered in the Americas and those others that they had been conquering around Oceania and discovering new places and in Indonesia, and they get this idea of what's called the noble savage. And this is the idea that non-modern people are living in this idyllic world free from the stresses of a complex society. This idea that the Native American was one that lived in this peaceful society before Europeans came in with all their complexities and kind of ruined things. If only we could all return to the simpler times of living off the land in a hunter-gatherer society. And this noble savage, of course, kind of heightens that of the other, and especially of those who Europeans considered less civilized. But at the same time, there's also an air of superiority on the European behalf for the way that they still view them. They still view it as we are the more complex, we are the better fitted. However, they are so simple that, gosh, their life must be so easy, which of course was not the case. As Europe begins to industrialize, and specifically during the 19th century, we see even more developments in science and technology and things that are going to allow Europe to, again, not just grow in political and economic might, but also in cultural might. And we see different ideas and new discoveries on how mankind views the world. And one came from the man Charles Darwin. And Darwin is best known for his thought on and discovery of, or explanation of, human evolution and evolution of the species. Darwin believed that that all species, the way they are a product of slow changes over time, brought about by the fact that the only species that survive are the ones that live long enough in order to mate. And so essentially what we've seen through a process known as survival of the fittest is only those who live the longest are going to have the time and opportunity to mate. So therefore, animals are going to adapt to their surroundings, and those with those adaptations that are going to be most helpful are going to continue to live. Well, this idea of survival of the fittest is then going to be applied to different human societies, particularly as Europe is looking outside of itself. It had already been smashing into the Indian Ocean trade. It had already been through a whole colonial process in the Americas. Europeans were well aware that they were not the only ones living in this world anymore. And humans began to use what was considered a quasi-scientific way of looking at how they relate to others. And particularly in answering the question, well, why are Europeans industrialized and everybody else isn't? And this leads to an idea called social Darwinism. And what social Darwinism does is it divides different human societies into different races. These races are categorized by human physical features, most notably skin color. So during the 19th century, this is when race was invented, as Europeans are trying to look at the differences between different human populations and trying to say, okay, well, how would a biologist look at this? Well, they would look at the physical characteristics and they would notice the differences. Skin color was one. Some scientists, as you can see here from a textbook, took it a little bit further and looked at the shape of skulls and some of the shape of the faces, and divided humans up into these different categories or races. And according to their argument, because of these physical differences, and because some of these differences seem to more closely resemble apes, another one of Charles Darwin's theory was that humans evolved from apes, what social Darwinists believed is that there were some races that were more evolved than others. And since Europeans were the furthest in there, according to their research, from that of apes, because Europeans were the most industrialized, the most modernized, clearly they are the most evolved, which therefore then means those who are not European are even less evolved. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the beginning of racism as a concept. Race didn't exist before the 19th century. There were concepts of others, but this is the first time you see race being applied, and especially this idea that there are some races that are more evolved or more civilized than others. And you can, of course, see this example here in this image that not only looks at the different skull shapes of a European, and I love how they use the head of an Apollo statue from Greek, like the perfect European, and then they use a very stereotypical, very racist depiction of an African, and they compare these skull shapes, and they say, oh, well, the African skull looks much closer to the chimpanzees, so therefore they must be less evolved. And then, of course, you have these depictions of Africans in different places around the world. And again, skull shapes are all supposed to be taken into consideration. So again, this is the development of racism and the way that Europeans see themselves in comparison to others. This idea then gets modified in another idea known as the white man's burden. And especially as we look at why Europeans are specifically looking out. Yes, we talked about the economic causes, the resources, the labor, and the new markets. But there's also a cultural one. And since Europeans believed that they were the most civilized, some Europeans, particularly Christian missionaries, believed that it was their role in society to try and civilize others, to go to these other places that Europe is gaining control over, and to try and Christianize them, to try to teach them middle-class values, to try to make them more European. And in some cases, this is seen not just with Europeans. It happened in the United States as well. One of the saddest examples of American history is when the U.S. government took Native American children away from their families and forced them into assimilation schools, not allowing them to speak their native languages, not allowing them to practice their native customs, and trying to westernize or Americanize them in order to try and force assimilation. And so you see this known as the white man's burden, this duty of the white civilized man to try and fix those issues found in the others. And this became a very widespread idea. It wasn't just a few people. Here's an example of a soap advertisement. Pear Soap, which is still a soap brand in Europe, maybe even in the United States, I don't know, I've never seen Pear Soap, but is the first step towards lightening the white man's burden. And it's through teaching the virtues of cleanliness. Now you can see middle class values there. Teaching cleanliness. Pear Soap is a potent factor in brightening the dark corners of the earth as civilization advances. Oh my gosh, they actually believe you can use that soap to wash the black off. Oh, you think I'm being dramatic, don't you? Oh, you do? Well, let's just go ahead and check this out here. Pear Soap, Social Darwinism. And let's just look at some images here, see if we can find the better image that I always... Oh, I found it. Ladies and gentlemen, literally believing they could wash the black off using Pear's soap. So again, very racist depiction of an African, possibly an African American, a white European using Pear's soap, and check it out. The skin is as white as alabaster. So again, this idea that it is the white man's duty in order to do so. And that's where you get depictions like this one as well. Now I know it's fuzzy and I'm sorry, but you can see John Bull, who is kind of the British version of Uncle Sam, and Uncle Sam, carrying this group of natives, very characteristically drawn, very racist, very drawn in a very racist way, carrying them towards this golden idol of civilization. And you can't read these rocks, unfortunately, but it's greed, corruption, and barbarism is one of them. So again, they're carrying them because it's the white man's burden to carry those who are not white towards civilization. So this is the way that Europeans saw others. And so as Europeans are dealing with these empires in Ottoman Empire, in China, in Japan, and eventually as we get into the next chapter and they start taking over places in Africa, Asia, and Oceania, this is kind of the perspective that they are taking with. Now, it's pretty easy to always then look at Europeans and say, oh, well, Europeans are just a bunch of racist jerks, and to put all this blame on Europeans. And while there's absolutely blame that is deserved, it's also important to understand that there are Asian perceptions of other as well. And Europeans were not the only ones to think of themselves as the most evolved, and they may be the only ones that use that word, but at least they're not going to be the only ones that think they are the most civilized. So let's look at China for just a bit. For China's entire history, it's always considered itself the Middle Kingdom. And in fact, China has believed that anybody who is not Chinese, who is not a black haired son of Han, is quite simply a barbarian. And they would use those terms in order to talk to them. Now, we saw that with the tribute system and their dealings with Central Asians. You also see that with the way that they deal with any other sort of trade relationship across Asia as well. And that's going to be the same thing that they take when they start to look at Europeans. And in fact, during the Ming Dynasty in early modern Europe, they decided to cut off foreign trade because they wanted to save China for the Chinese. And so they cut off all foreign trade except in Canton. I believe there was another Guangzhou, might have been the other port. I can never remember what the other port is. But they cut off trade except for through those different points, and they only really did trade with other with other Asian peoples. They cut especially Europeans off. Now, this is going to take a bit of a shift. Oh, by the way, and then the Qing dynasty then continues that as the Manchus then come in and do so. Well, now this is going to start to take a different turn, especially as we get into the 19th century. Europeans, as we know, have always demanded Chinese goods. And my wife is sitting here listening to me right now, and she knows that we demand Chinese goods because she also, as we discussed as an engaged couple, we realized that we had to have a porcelain set of dishware that we still have yet to use in a formal setting. So Europeans and Westerners always desire fine Chinese goods in China. And so when we look at the relationship between Europeans and the Chinese during this time period, Europeans are trying to figure out how can we continue to get access to Chinese goods while we're cut off. And then in addition, since the Chinese government is no longer demanding so much silver, what European product is it that they could give the Chinese in order to keep buying Chinese products? And they had a brilliant idea. And that idea is to sell them opium. Opium had already become a recreational drug used across China. It had spread from the Ottoman Empire. It is something that had been used traditionally as a medicine, even as far back as ancient Egypt. But opium had become something of a recreational, like I said, recreational drug within China. And Europeans just so happened to control India during this time. And in India, the poppies grew like weeds. Get it? The poppies grew like weeds because it's drugs and they're... So the poppies are growing like weeds in India. And so Europeans had a cheap access to a whole host of opiates, of opiate production. And so they would be able to take the opium from India and ship it illegally into China. Now, of course, this causes the Chinese government to declare it illegal. In fact, at one point in Canton, Commissioner Lin is going to confiscate all the British opium. They're going to gather it in a big pit. They're going to light it on fire, and they're just going to relax for a little bit. But they can only relax for a little bit because the British government is going to then send its forces, its naval forces, and absolutely just bombard Canton until the Chinese Qing dynasty gives in. And that's known as the Opium Wars. And the major effect of the Opium Wars is the Treaty of Nanking, which gave the British access to specific areas of China, essentially saying that the British had trading rights had sole trading rights in this one specific area in China. Well, once other European powers figured this out, they realized that they could also force China to sign these unequal treaties. And so China gets divided up into what are known as spheres of influence. And so you see Britain doing it, you see Russia getting in there, you see Japan getting in there even, you see Germany you see all these European powers that are going to gain economic control over specific areas within China. And they don't get political control, but they do get economic control. And that's where they're known as spheres of influence. And so part of the Treaty of Nanking actually, and part of these other treaties, is that the Chinese were no longer, it was written in here, how extra is this? They wrote in the Treaty of Nanking that they were not allowed to call Europeans barbarians anymore. And so Europeans are again upset at this idea of being called barbarians. They see themselves as the more civilized group, and they see that their industrial might and their ability to absolutely demolish the Chinese Navy as a proof of that. Now we look at Japan, and especially as we look at Japan kind of on the eve of what the event we're going to look at is the Meiji Restoration. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Japan. Japan had a history of European contact. In fact, Japan was one of those places that the Dutch especially, but also other Catholic Jesuit priests are going to be trading with during the early modern era. And when Europeans eventually landed on Japan, the Japanese immediately, like the Chinese, saw them as barbarians. In fact, they said, oh, they all have blue eyes, and they all have red hairs. And they looked at Europeans and said, oh, you're gross, because the Japanese had a tradition of bathing daily. Europeans did not. In addition, Japanese had been using chopsticks as utensils for centuries, and Europeans were still eating with their hands. So they literally looked at these Europeans as absolute slobs and barbarians, and for some good reason. But they came up with these racist characterizations that they're all blue-eyed, they're all red-haired. And Japan, like China, is also going to expel Jesuits. When the Tokugawa shogunate takes power, as we studied in our last early modern time period, one of the first things they do is they're going to cut Japan off from Europeans. Why? Well, they saw the spread of Christianity throughout Japan as a challenge to their power. They wanted Japan for the Japanese, and they saw Christianity as something that was corrupting the Japanese. And so they violently expelled the Jesuits and most of the Europeans, and they shut it down to trade. The only European group that was allowed in were the Dutch. Why? Because they were Protestant and they weren't as concerned with missionary activity. But the Japanese went so far as at one point they captured a Dutch trading ship that was trying to illegally send goods into Japan, and they cut off the heads of everybody except for I think like 16 or so people. And they sent those people back to tell everybody what happened to them so that nobody would ever come back to Japan. So again, they expelled Europeans. They saw Europeans as barbarians, as somebody as corrupting their population. But this is all going to change because Japan stayed shut out, and Japan watched from afar as the Europeans gained more and more influence over China, especially with the Opium Wars, the Treaty of Nanking, and the growth of those spheres of influence. And eventually, the United States decided that they also wanted to get into the game in Asia. And so the U.S. president sends Matthew Perry over to Japan in order to try and convince the Japanese to be friends. Because Matthew Perry plays Chandler Bing in Friends, and Matthew Perry was the guy who opened... I really waste all my good jokes on you guys. It just never really sticks. Fine. But ladies and gentlemen, Matthew Perry wants to become friends. Well, really what Matthew Perry does is he takes his naval fleet and he begins to do modern naval military exercises outside of Tokyo and outside of the harbor of Tokyo, and is essentially intimidating the Japanese, flexing in front of them, saying, hey, look at how awesome our cannon ships are, our gunships are, our modern warships are. And the Tokugawa government realizes very quickly that if we try to fight back, it's going to be another Treaty of Nanking. And so they simply just capitulate and they sign agreements, they open up the treaty ports, and this causes a social crisis in Japan. And this causes especially the samurai to revolt. They're seen as the Tokugawa government is seen as this weak power that gave in to these European barbarians, and you see a revolution occurring. And that revolution is occurring, is called the Meiji Restoration, where the Tokugawa shogunate is deposed, is kicked out of power. And in their stead, the emperor is restored to their rightful rule. Now, the emperor had been ruling all along, but now the emperor is going to have total control. But at the same time, the process of the Meiji Restoration is also going to be the state-run industrialization of Japan. The Japanese government, now under the enlightened Emperor Meiji, is going to dramatically change their society, borrow and buy from the West, buy American weaponry, buy American factory equipment, buy European equipment, change their constitution to model that of the German constitution. They're going to open themselves up dramatically to trade with both Americans and Europeans, or the West, and we're going to see some major impacts in Japan because of that. So again, just to tie this part up, both Europeans and Asians looked down on the other group. They looked at each other as barbarians. They looked at them as less civilized, less worthy, and that's going to be one of the points of conflict that's going to continue between Europe and Asia into the 21st century, and I would argue in a lot of ways even still characterizes the relationship in some ways today. So I'm going to get out of this one, and we're going to go to our first supplemental assignment, or our second supplemental assignment. And that assignment is going to be another DBQ assignment. And this time it's going to be based on the Meiji Restoration. So here we go. As you can see here, I've already started doing the DBQ by going through steps 1 through 3 on this first page. Step 1 is to read all the directions. I've read all the directions. I've highlighted the important parts that I think are really relevant just to remind myself what is it that the College Board expects me to do. I then broken down the prompt, analyze and explain, being the action words, the impact of the Meiji Restoration, that's the topic, on Japan and the world, which are the places, and then circa 1850 to 1914. And so we're looking at this specific time period after the Meiji Restoration. I then, as part of step 2, breaking down the prompt, I put the prompt in my own way. How did the Meiji Restoration impact Japan and its neighbors? That's essentially what we're looking for. I've put that in my own words. I then completed step 3, which is brainstorming possible answers to the prompt, and I wrote down just things that I could maybe see in these documents from what I learned in chapter 19. Maybe industrialization, maybe a new middle class, maybe Enlightenment values, maybe there's the westernization of Japanese culture, maybe there's a syncretism of both, maybe there's economic prosperity, maybe there's terrible working living conditions, maybe the Japanese are going to grow a major empire. I don't know. But those are just possible things that are priming the pump, getting me ready to read these documents. Now, step 4 is actually going through and reading the documents. Now, normally I do document 1. I'm going to let you do documents 1 and 2. And when you read through the documents, you go around the horn. Now, what does around the horn mean? Well, around the horn means that you start by looking at how does the document answer the question. Well, from this document, it's a visual document, so you can kind of see it as I'm going through. And in fact, I can, yes. As we look at this document, and we can see it's an inside view of a factory. You can see the machines that are producing. You see the women who are probably separating the silk worm from the cocoon and kind of separating the silk bed so they can actually get the threads. And you see men walking around in European dress. Look at this top hats that you can see here, the jackets, but you also see people walking around in quasi-Japanese outfits as well. So it seems like there's this not clash, but there's this syncretism. There's this coming together of European and Japanese culture. So how does it answer the question? Well, the impact is it's industrialization, westernization, syncretism of Western and Japanese traditions, maybe the growth of a new middle class, especially since this is discussing the zaibatsu, or those kind of financial cliques of business owners. Essentially those groups of individuals who are going to be taking over the state-run businesses after the state sells it to them. So I then do a HIP analysis here on the side, figuring out the historical context, the intended audience, the point of view, and the purpose. I get as specific as I can. The intended audience for this one, I didn't know, so I put not exactly sure. And that's okay too. I then figured out some outside information. I talked about how the Japanese government installs wires to conduct electricity. They're also installing trolley cars and other modes of public transportation to get workers to get to their jobs and for goods to circulate. So you don't see that here, but that's also part of it, and that also proves industrialization and westernization. And then I also talk about the zaibatsu become the new middle class. It's not really discussed here. You think so, but you're not exactly sure. And they become very wealthy off their ownership of factories. I then look at how does this document relate to the other ones. And I can see that it's corroborated by documents 1, 2, 5, and 6, but it's also modified in documents 4, 5, 6, and 7. Yes, documents 5 and 6 both corroborate and modify. It depends on which part of the document you use. So this is going around the horn. I do want you to go around the horn for the other documents that are here. So documents 1, 2, and then 4 through 7. And that's step 4. Once you get through step 4, I then want you to go to what step 5 is. Now with step 5, you're going to do this analysis section. And on this PDF that I made here, it looks a little bit different, so I'm sorry about that. It will look a little neater on your Google Doc. But here's how you're supposed to do it. Step 5, you begin the process of what's known as grouping the documents. You want to start thinking about how the documents work together to answer the question. And when you find a group of documents that work together, that's going to make up a body paragraph. So here's what I did. I put the numbers of documents that I think work together to make specific arguments. I want you to look at these documents and come up what you think the argument is that I'm trying to that I had in my head. And same thing for argument 2. So I want you to look at documents 1, 2, 3, 5, and 6 and say, okay, how do they show an impact of the Meiji Restoration on Japan or the world? And maybe for argument 1, you'll focus on Japan. For argument 2, I want you to look at documents 4, 5, 6, and 7. How does it impact Japan's neighbors? What's the argument that this document is showing? So again, I'm having you practice. The last assignment, I gave you the argument and I said which documents prove it. Now I'm giving you the documents and I want you to come up with the argument. That's a way for you to practice grouping the documents. Then, just like you did last time, I want you to practice using the documents by proving it. And I give you an example by using document 7. You may not use document 7. Please use a different one. But document 7 shows a map of Japanese conquests across Asia and Oceania by 1939. That's, in general, what the evidence is that I'm using. This proves my argument because Japan joined Europe in building global empires to fuel their industrial might and eventually led to them being considered a world power. I might have given you a hint to that second argument. And then today, what I also want you to practice, and I made this PDF a little bit early, but the second thing I want you to practice as we're going through the DBQ skills is I want you to practice doing what's called a hip check. Now, with the hip check, and when you're writing your essay, for 2 of the documents, 3 on a normal DBQ, but for the 2 of the documents, you need to explain how the historical context, intended audience, purpose, or point of view is relevant to your argument. And so I'm going to ask that you do 2 hip checks, choose 2 of the documents, and explain how one of those things is relevant. Here's an example, and I did it for document 3 because that was the one that I did. The historical context of this document is relevant. Notice how I'm slapping the reader in the face. I'm using the exact wording that they are looking for. The historical context of this document is relevant because the Meiji government had already begun a process of state-run industrialization before they sold those businesses to the Zaibatsu. They provided the necessary Western-style infrastructure such as electricity, roads, railways, and trolleys to support these businesses. Therefore, the new owners were able to make vast amount of money by continuing and improving upon these businesses in the private sector. I could use this for an argument on the adoption of Westernization or Western industrialization. I could also probably apply this to a new middle class in the Zaibatsu as well. But I just want you to know, I explain in a sentence how it proves how it is relevant, and then I give another more specific explanation just to hit the idea home. So you're going to you're going to group the documents, you're going to use the documents, you're going to practice hip check, and then I'd also like you to practice writing a synthesis statement. And when you're writing your synthesis statement, I want you to please compare the whatever arguments you are finding up here to what happened in the Ottoman Empire or the Qing dynasty. So again, in a synthesis point, that's one way of earning your analysis and reasoning point on the DBQ rubric. And one of the ways to do that is to kind of use evidence from a different place within the same time period that either corroborates or modifies your argument. So here's my example. Lowever, modernization didn't always result in an Asian power building an empire. The Qing dynasty completely collapsed after both lower classes revolted in the Boxer Rebellion, and then Western educated elites led a nationalist revolt in 1911. Modernization had failed to bring about positive changes for most of Chinese society, and many looked at the Manchus as just another evil foreign power corrupting China and oppressing its peoples. This led to the destruction of the dynasty system and the implementation of a republic, which soon fell into civil war. So, it doesn't always. I am modifying my argument by giving the example of the Qing dynasty. Obviously, you have to do a different one, so you can still use the Qing dynasty, but it has to be another way that it relates to your argument. So that's it. If you have any questions, please feel free to email me. I hope you enjoyed this video. Oftedal out.